Look, the president never rules out his options as commander-in-chief to protect the national interest of the United States. I can tell you right now with full certainty, we are not postured to, nor do we intend or expect to have to take any military action in Venezuela at any time. The only military presence you'll see in Venezuela is our Marine Guards at an embassy. Okay, that is our goal, that is our expectation, and that is what everything that outlines towards.
But
that said, if an Iranian drone factory pops up and threatens our forces in the region, the president retains the option to eliminate that threat.
I'm asking a more specific question because in your testimony, you suggest that you would use force to compel cooperation, for instance, with oil sales. Do you agree that you have to come to Congress to get authorization if you were simply using force to try to compel cooperation?
Well, there's two things. There's the
it seems like
under the War Powers Act. No, under the War Powers Act, if we're going to be involved in something that's going to put us involved in a sustained way, we have to notify you within 48 hours after the fact, and then if it's going to last longer than 60 days, we have to come to Congress with it. We don't anticipate either of these things having to happen. Everything is moving in a very different trajectory right now. On the other hand, if we tell them we don't want to see drones from Iran, as an example, pointed at the United States or threatening our forces or our presence in the region or our allies' presence in the region. And
watch this carefully, because this hearing starts with policy questions and ends with a full-on political meltdown. What you're about to see is Senator Chris Murphy slowly box Marco Rubio into a corner on one of the most controversial foreign policy issues in Washington right now, Venezuela. And the reason this exchange matters is because Murphy isn't just asking about diplomacy. He's asking about power. He's asking about military threats. He's asking about oil deals. And most importantly, he's asking who exactly benefits from this arrangement. Right out of the gate, Murphy frames the situation in brutal terms. He says the United States is effectively taking Venezuelan oil at gunpoint, controlling the revenue, and deciding how that money gets used. That's not a minor accusation. That is a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the entire operation. And Rubio immediately understands the danger. Because this isn't one of those hearings where a senator rambles for 5 minutes and moves on. Murphy comes in with structure. 3 direct questions. No wandering, no distractions. And every single one of those questions targets a weak spot in Rubio's defense. First, why were oil licenses reportedly handed to companies connected to major Trump donors? Second, if Maduro's inner circle is still in power months from now, how can this possibly be called a success? And third, and this is where the room starts tightening up, would the administration use military force if Venezuela stopped cooperating? Pay attention to that last one, because it changes the temperature of the hearing completely. Murphy is basically saying, are you threatening force to protect oil interests? That is the implication hanging over this entire exchange, and Rubio tries to walk a very careful line. He wants to sound tough enough for the administration's base, while also avoiding the appearance of openly advocating military escalation. That balancing act becomes the entire story of this hearing. Because from this point on, Murphy keeps dragging Rubio back to specifics. Every time Rubio tries to broaden the conversation, Murphy narrows it again. This is where these hearings become revealing. Not because somebody confesses to a crime on camera, but because you can literally watch a public official struggle to hold together a narrative under sustained pressure. And the more Rubio talks, the more defensive the administration's position starts to sound.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I think the scope of the project that you are undertaking in Venezuela is without precedent. You are taking their oil at gunpoint. You are holding and selling that oil, putting for now the receipts in an offshore Middle Eastern account. You're deciding how and for what purposes that money is going to be used in a country of 30 million people. I think a lot of us believe that that is destined for failure. And I know that you're telling us today just to be patient, but a month later, we have no information on a timetable for a democratic transition. Maduro's people are still in charge. Most of the political prisoners are in jail. And by the way, those that have been let out have a gag order on them from the government. The opposition leader is still in exile. This looks already like it is a failure. You say you're in serious talks, but as you note, the Venezuelans are great at being in serious talks. They almost never deliver. So I'm just going to give you my three questions and hope that you'll answer them, because I do think we want to try to understand how to judge the efficacy of this as time goes on, because I worry you won't be back before this committee anytime soon, and to understand whether this is just facilitating corruption, both in Venezuela and here at home. So here are my three questions. First, reports are that you've given no-bid licenses to two companies to sell Venezuela's oil. One of them is a massive donor to the president. To many Americans, that reeks. And so my question is, can you commit that partners for future sales are going to be chosen through a fair, open selection process? Second, if Delcy Rodriguez, who is an unelected leader, the head of Maduro's torture operation, is still in power 6 months from now, does that mean that your policy is a success or failure? How do we judge when we've had enough of Rodriguez? And third, in your testimony, you reserved the right to use force again in the future if the Venezuelan government isn't complying with your requests. So if, for instance, they refused to give you access to the oil in the future, if they said, we're just going to keep it for ourselves, would this cause you to consider military action? And do you concede that if you're using military action simply to try to compel cooperation from the government, you absolutely need congressional authorization for that? So if you can answer those three questions.
So the first question was about the trading companies. The second is about Delcy still in power 6 months from now.
6 months from now.
And the third is on the use of force.
Yes.
Okay. On the first one, the two traders. So here's the problem we faced. The problem we faced in the short term is they had no place to put oil. They were running out of storage capacity for their oil. We had to move that oil to market very quickly. The only way to move it to market very quickly is to plug into these two primary trade companies that could sell it in the open market. That is not the permanent outcome here. That is a short-term fix to a short-term problem, which is they were literally storing oil. They brought in tankers and had tankers sitting offshore just to hold their oil. At some point, their capacity to produce was going to be shut down and their ability to generate revenue. So we had to move that oil very quickly. The long-term plan is not those two trading companies. The long-term plan is for them to have a normal energy program that sells directly into the market, directly, to refineries and to companies that are exploiting and exploring it. For example, Chevron has operations there that never stopped. They seek to expand those operations. They don't need those trading companies. So those trading companies were a short-term fix for a very acute problem because we wanted to prevent societal collapse because they had no money for revenue. On the second point about her being still in power, look, let me say this, a couple things. This is not unprecedented. I can point to a number of places, Spain, Paraguay, two examples of places in which there was a transition, from an autocratic regime to a democratic regime, and it took time. I can't give you a timeline of how long it takes. It can't take forever. It's not even been 4 weeks since Maduro was reduced.
A year, two
Well, I think
years?
we need to be, let me put it to you this way, we need to be much further along 6 months from now, even 3 months from now. That may not be satisfactory to you, but I'm saying we have to be much further along 3, 4, 5 months. 3 or 4, 5 months from now cannot look like what today looks like. And I think there's acknowledgement on both sides of that. I can probably give you a better answer, and this is not deflecting, when we finally have people on the ground like the ambassador and the team around her on a daily basis that are interacting. Because one thing is for me to pick up the phone and talk to Delcy Rodriguez 3 times a week. Another thing is to have someone on the ground on a daily basis that's following these events, is talking to civil society, but also engaging with interim authorities. But the fact of the matter is that, yes, we want to see quick progress. As you said, it's unprecedented, okay? All I'm saying to you is, before this was stagnant. Before this, we had spent 14 years, you were involved in some of those efforts, 14 years trying to change the dynamic in Venezuela. 13, 12, 11, 10, it was a big part of my career in the Senate was spent on this. This is the first time in over a decade that we see even the glimmer of an opportunity to change conditions. A lot of that will depend on us, but a lot of that will depend on them. And it also will depend on the rest of Venezuelan society. How quickly can we get all these Venezuelans that want to go back to Venezuela and participate in civic and economic life back to Venezuela? That's going to be critical here. We recognize that. So yes, we have to be much further along in 6 months. We expect to be further along. And if we're not, I'll tell you. We'll tell you. On the third point of use of force.
Okay, this is where the pressure campaign really starts working. Murphy's strategy here is actually pretty disciplined. He doesn't interrupt constantly. He doesn't try to dominate the room emotionally. Instead, he keeps returning to the same core issue: accountability. And Rubio clearly wants to reframe the conversation as a complicated international stabilization effort. But Murphy keeps pulling it back to something much more politically dangerous. Who profits? Who gets power? And what happens if this fails? Notice how Rubio answers the question about the donor-linked oil companies. He says they were a temporary fix because Venezuela needed immediate oil distribution capacity. Now, politically, that answer matters because he never actually disputes the core concern Murphy raised, that companies connected to major Trump donors received no bid access. Instead, he reframes it as urgency. That's a very important distinction, because when officials stop denying the underlying arrangement and instead defend the necessity of it, the debate shifts from "did this happen" to "was it justified?" And Murphy knows that. That's why he immediately pivots to the timeline question. This is one of the strongest moments in the hearing, because Rubio suddenly has to admit something the administration probably does not want highlighted publicly. They don't actually know how long this could take. Murphy paints the situation as stalled. Maduro's people are still in power. Political prisoners remain jailed. Opposition figures are still sidelined. And Rubio's answer basically boils down to trust the process. That answer did not calm the room. Because Murphy isn't asking whether progress is theoretically possible. He's asking when the administration admits the strategy is failing. And Rubio never gives a clean benchmark. Instead, he starts referencing historical transitions in other countries, saying democratic transitions take time. Now, politically, that sounds reasonable on paper. But in a hearing environment, long explanations without concrete commitments often sound like drift. Especially when Murphy keeps hammering the same point. How do we measure success? That's the trap Rubio keeps stepping into. Murphy is demanding measurable standards. Rubio is offering strategic optimism. And then we get to the military force section, the moment where the hearing goes from tense to genuinely explosive. Watch how Murphy phrases it. He doesn't accuse Rubio of planning an invasion outright. He asks whether military action could be used simply to compel cooperation over oil access. That wording is devastating, because it forces Rubio into a politically toxic zone. If Rubio rules it out completely, he looks weak to hardliners. If he leaves the door open, it sounds like the administration is willing to threaten force over economic interests. And Rubio tries to thread the needle. He says they do not anticipate military action. He says they are not postured for it. He says the only military presence would be embassy guards. But then, and this is the key moment, he refuses to fully close the door. Instead, he introduces hypothetical threats involving Iran and drones. That shift tells you everything. Because once Rubio moves into hypotheticals, Murphy's original question has already disrupted the administration's clean narrative. From this point forward, Rubio sounds less like someone confidently explaining policy and more like someone trying to contain political fallout. And Murphy senses it immediately. That's why he doubles down on congressional authorization. He's forcing Rubio to confront constitutional limits in public. Not in a cable news interview, not in a campaign speech, on the Senate record. And suddenly, Rubio's answers get longer, more cautious, more layered with qualifiers. That is usually a sign the witness understands the stakes just went up. This is the moment everything shifts.
Never rules out his options as commander-in-chief to protect the national interest of the United States. I can tell you right now with full certainty, we are not postured to, nor do we intend or expect to have to take any military action in Venezuela at any time. The only military presence you'll see in Venezuela is our Marine guards at an embassy. Okay, that is our goal, that is our expectation, and that is what everything that outlines towards.
But if you-
That said, if an Iranian drone factory pops up and threatens our forces in the region, the president retains the option to eliminate that threat.
I'm asking a more specific question because in your testimony, you suggest that you would use force to compel cooperation, for instance, with oil sales. Do you agree that you have to come to Congress to get authorization if you were simply using force to try to compel cooperation?
Well, there's two things. There's the
It seems like
under
an
the
easy
War
answer.
Powers Act. No, under the War Powers Act, if we're going to be involved in something that's going to put us involved in a sustained way, we have to notify you within 48 hours after the fact, and then if it's going to last longer than 60 days, we have to come to Congress with it. We don't anticipate either of these things having to happen. Everything is moving in a very different trajectory right now. On the other hand, if we tell them we don't want to see drones from Iran, as an example, pointed at the United States or threatening our forces or our presence in the region or our allies' presence in the region, and they refuse to comply with that, the president does reserve the option in self-defense to eliminate that threat. We don't see that, we don't anticipate it, but it could happen. But we hope not. We don't want it to happen. On the contrary, if we had to take military action, it would set us back on all these other things that we're talking about. I can tell you military action is not good for recovery and transition. That's not what we hope to see. It's certainly not our goal here. But a lot of that will depend on them. But I think it would require the emergence of an
Now here comes the payoff. This second clip is where Murphy finally corners Rubio into the contradiction, sitting underneath the administration's entire position. Because Rubio spends the first half of the hearing insisting military escalation is not the goal. But Murphy keeps pushing one very simple question. What happens if Venezuela refuses to cooperate? And suddenly, Rubio starts talking about presidential authority, self-defense, imminent threats, and the War Powers Act. That's a massive shift. Murphy asked about compelling cooperation. Rubio answered with national security hypotheticals. That disconnect matters because it reveals the political balancing act happening in real time. Rubio wants maximum leverage without publicly owning the consequences of escalation. And Murphy is trying to expose exactly that. Watch how Rubio repeatedly says they don't anticipate military action. That phrasing is incredibly careful. Not we will not. Not under no circumstances, just we don't anticipate. In Washington language, that means the option stays alive. And Murphy knows it. That's why he keeps dragging Rubio back to congressional authority. Because once military force enters the conversation, the legal and political stakes become much higher than a foreign policy debate. Now it becomes a constitutional power fight. And the more Rubio explains, the more defensive the administration's posture starts to sound. Especially when Rubio says military action would set recovery efforts back. That's actually one of the most revealing admissions in the hearing. Because it acknowledges the obvious contradiction Murphy has been pointing at the entire time. Threatening force while claiming to support democratic recovery creates instability. And here's why viewers reacted so strongly to this exchange online. Murphy came into this hearing sounding focused and methodical. Rubio came in trying to project total control. But by the end, Murphy had Rubio constantly qualifying his answers, constantly reframing, constantly trying to narrow the implications of what he had just said. That's not dominance. That's damage management. And politically, the hearing exposed a deeper problem for the administration. They want to sell the Venezuela strategy as humanitarian, stabilizing, and democratic. But Murphy kept forcing the conversation back to oil, donors, force, and executive power. That framing is dangerous because it changes how viewers interpret every answer Rubio gives afterward. Even when Rubio sounds calm, the underlying questions never disappear. Who benefits from this? What are the limits of executive authority? And how far would this administration actually go if cooperation collapses? Those are the questions Murphy planted into this hearing, and Rubio never fully neutralized them. By the end of the exchange, Rubio is no longer driving the conversation. He's reacting to it. And in hearings like this, once you're reacting instead of controlling, the political damage usually starts spreading fast, especially when the clips hit social media. especially when viewers start replaying the moments where the answers got complicated. Because those are the moments people remember, not the polished opening statement, not the prepared language, the hesitation, the qualifiers, the pivots. If you want more breakdowns like this, where powerful people get pressed on the record, hit subscribe and drop your take in the comments. Who do you think came out stronger in this hearing? And what was the one moment that changed the whole exchange?